Joining me in a moment is the head of United Nations Watch, Hillel Neuer. Many of you will know Hillel. He calls out the disgraceful bias against Israel in the United Nations and its affiliated bodies. He's fully across the unfolding drama we have here, where Scott Morrison is dealing with an uproar over his decision to look at moving our embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. When the United States decided to recognise Jerusalem as Israel's capital, it faced condemnation from 128 countries at the United Nations. Only 9 voted with it. Israel stands alone, and people forget this, Israel stands alone as the only place in the world where its capital city is not recognised by the rest of the world. Labor and even some Liberal MPs, and we heard that today, are calling on Morrison to back down. They seem to want to allow the critics of Israel, even anti-Semites, to determine our foreign policy. And in doing so, they are playing into the hands of the international community, which condemns anything Israel does. Now, over the next month in the United Nations General Assembly, there are going to be 20 condemnations of Israel. By contrast, there are just 6 condemnations for all other countries put together. One for Iran, Syria, North Korea, Crimea, Myanmar and the United States. But nothing for Saudi Arabia, Zimbabwe or Venezuela. It follows an appalling record at both the United Nations General Assembly and at the United Nations Human Rights Council. Joining me now, live from Prague, is Hillel Neuer. Thank you so much for your time, Hillel, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sharri. My pleasure to be here.
Now, why is there this atrocious bias against Israel at all of these United Nations bodies?
Well, the United Nations was founded after World War II in the name of principles like human rights, freedom, security. Sadly, however, in the past decades, we've seen the world body become hijacked by dictatorships, and the scapegoating of Israel is the prime example of how that works, where some of the world's worst dictatorships, led, of course, by the Arab and Islamic states like Syria, Libya, Yemen, and others, seek to deflect attention from their own genocide, mass human rights abuses, by scapegoating the world's only Jewish state, and for reasons of vote trading, oil, sovereign wealth funds, perhaps some anti-Semitic feelings, they're able to each year have this absurd, obsessive, ritual demonization of Israel. As you said, 20 resolutions on Israel, 1 on North Korea. It's really absurd and pathological, and at the end of the day, it undermines the United Nations itself, because if standards are so selective and politicized, then they are not universal human rights standards at all.
And when you look at a body like, the United Nations Human Rights Council, some of the world's worst violators, worst human rights violators, are actually members of the council, elected to, and I quote, uphold the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights. You've got countries like Syria, where Bashar al-Assad has been found guilty of war crimes, including using chemical weapons against his own people. And, the civil war has had millions of refugees and people displaced. Venezuela, where opposition leaders have been thrown in jail, journalists intimidated and silenced, and the people have been starving. Saudi Arabia, which beheads its own citizens, kills and imprisons people who speak out against it or who happen to be homosexual or commit adultery. This is a joke. How can these sort of countries sit in judgment of the rest of the human rights around the world, including in Israel?
Well, look, it's the absolute opposite of everything we were promised. I was present in Geneva when the United Nations Human Rights Commission, which was founded in 1946, by Eleanor Roosevelt, when it was put to sleep, and they created in 2006 the new and improved Human Rights Council with the promise it would be reformed. Members would have, as you just read out, the highest standards of human rights. We were promised by activists like Ken Roth, who's the head of Human Rights Watch. He said from now on, countries with terrible records of human rights, like Saudi Arabia, won't be elected. Well, the exact opposite happened. Saudi Arabia has been elected time after time. The members today include Burundi, China, Cuba, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Eritrea was just elected again. So what you have is the world's worst abusers who want to be there so that they'll make sure they will never get criticized. And there as well, there was a special agenda item in every session on Israel alone. No other country in the world, not Sudan, not Syria, not North Korea, has that kind of attention. And the problem, Sharri, is not only dictatorships, in a way that's kind of obvious. Dictatorships are doing the obvious. The sad thing is when, as I mentioned, someone like Ken Roth, who's the head of Human Rights Watch, when they seek to apologize, when you have progressive human rights activists, social justice activists, who apologize for the UN because they like the fact that the UN is willing to target Western countries. We just had the UN Human Rights Council's expert on poverty, I believe he's Australian, Philip Alston, expert on extreme poverty, and he went to visit the United Kingdom. He's just been to America last year. So instead of visiting the world's poorest countries where people are literally starving, they're focusing their scrutiny and their, I'd say, moral outrage against the West. And that's something that the dictatorships like as well. So you have this toxic alliance between some progressive activists and the anti-Western dictatorships. And that's really what is most problematic for me.
Do you think the rest of the world should be standing up and maybe pulling out of these bodies? The United States obviously did it under Donald Trump and Nikki Haley's leadership, and Nikki has been amazing highlighting these sort of problems. Do you think Australia should pull out? Britain, why are we still part of these sort of bodies?
Well, Sharri, it depends. I think that there are some bodies that, like it or not, they're not going away. The UN Human Rights Council, we saw it in 2006. America pulled out, did not join the new council in 2006 to 2009. Things only got worse. I was there, and Pakistan, Egypt, they owned the room. The worst dictatorships owned the room, and it didn't go away. So I think one has to be strategic. Our group, even though we are the strongest critic of the abuses of the Human Rights Council, we actually urged America. I testified in Congress and the Senate, urged America to stay and fight. You mentioned Nikki Haley. We'd like to have a Nikki Haley be in Geneva at the Human Rights Council speaking every day. So I think it's a strategic question. We don't think countries should be there because it's a good place. There are only a handful of good things that get to happen there. We'd like to see the best countries speak out, even if they're going to be outvoted. We'd like to see them do the most they can to put attention on the abusers. Nikki Haley tried about 2 weeks ago to introduce language on Cuba, 8 amendments that would have called out Cuba's human rights abuses. Sadly, the rest of the world, apart from Israel, refused to support that language and voted with Cuba to condemn America. So I think the human rights priorities of the European Union, for example, are very messed up, to be honest.
But why not start over again? I mean, in 2005, the then UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan abolished what was the precursor to the United Nations Human Rights Council, which was the UN Commission on Human Rights, partly because it was engaging in vote trading, and that was a big scandal. But why not do that again? Why not try abolish this entire body and start fresh?
Well, it sounds great, Sharri, and we supported Kofi Annan when he did that. It was really a unique moment, and part of it was he came under pressure for some corruption allegations against his son connected with Oil for Food. He was under pressure from America, and a way to sort of change the subject and look good was to promote this dramatic reform. We don't have that constitutional moment again, and the fact is, Sharri, that if we recreated the Human Rights Council, we'd wind up with the same rotten ingredients as before. At the end of the day, it's not about some kind of institutional reform. It's about our own liberal democracies doing the right thing. And so I pose the question, I'm here speaking to you from Prague and the European Union, why don't France, Britain, Germany, Austria, Czech Republic, other countries, why are they failing to introduce a single resolution on China, Cuba, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela at the UN General Assembly? We don't need institutional reform to do that, or at the Human Rights Council. They have the possibility to do it today. At the end of the day, it's about political will. We don't want to divert attention to institutional discussions. We want our own liberal democracies to call out the worst abusers, to speak out for human rights victims worldwide, and they're not doing it. Instead, what we just saw on Friday was France, Britain, Germany, and all EU countries joined the jackals, in the words of the late, great U.S. Ambassador and Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. They joined the jackals in singling out Israel 9 times. And as you said, Sharri, there's going to be 20 in this session, when most of the world's countries will get 0, only a handful will get 1. Western democracies should not be going along with that kind of pathological lynching. Bad for the UN, bad for human rights.
Now, Hillel, another issue that's gripping us in Australia, which I know you're across, is that our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has said he's going to look at moving our embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem to recognise it as the capital. This has sparked a backlash in Indonesia. The Malaysian Prime Minister has come out and said that this could increase the possibility of terrorism. What's your response to this?
Well, Mahathir Mohamad is one of the world's most notorious anti-Semites. Talks about hook-nosed Jews who control the world's economy and every anti-Semitic stereotype you like. He's open about being anti-Semitic. So I'm not sure that Australia needs to defer to him. Look, there's a mob in Pakistan now, thousands of people who shut down the country for several days because they want to kill a Christian woman named Asya Bibi because they say that she blasphemed against the Prophet Muhammad. And we learned that the UK and other countries are afraid to take her in because there'll be a backlash against their consulates and whatnot. So look, we can have our entire foreign policy dictated by the mobs in Pakistan, and we could sell out every Christian woman, and every country that wants to have their own capital be recognized, which is the perfectly normal thing. I was in Canberra, in your capital, and I don't think Australia would like it one bit if, for some reason, countries would decide to move the embassies elsewhere. I think Australia ought to do the right thing. America has moved their capital. The Czech Republic now has something called Jerusalem House in Jerusalem. Some Latin American countries have talked about it. The Brazilian president has done it. So actually, I think you have a cross-regional coalition of countries saying, this is wrong. We're not going to defer to the mob. And I've been to your country. I think Australia is a great democracy. It's a country that really is principled at its root. The citizens believe in decency and fairness and what is right. And it's right for Australia to have their embassy in Jerusalem, where in any case, Australian leaders visit the Prime Minister of Israel in the Knesset or in the Supreme Court, where it's all based in Western Jerusalem. There's absolutely nothing wrong with Australia having their embassy there. It's the right thing to do.
When you were here last time, I interviewed you, Hillel, and we did a great story together about Saudi Arabia and how it had done a deal with Britain to get on the United Nations Human Rights Council. Now, I noticed Saudi Arabia isn't getting condemned at all on this body over the next month, despite the admission that it was involved in killing the journalist.
Chopped up one of their own people.
Amazing. And
I mean, the whole world is talking about Khashoggi, this gentleman, Washington Post journalist. He had some issues in his own past, but he was a Washington Post journalist who was basically chopped up in the Saudi embassy. You'd think the whole world is talking about it. The Human Rights Council would reflect what is going on in the world. As you said, Sharri, not a peep out of the Human Rights Council, no emergency session, no commission of inquiry, no resolution. The Human Rights Council is silent on Saudi government murder.
It's just astounding. It's appalling. Just very quickly, because we have to go to break, do you think this goes further than anti-Israel or anti-Israel bias? Do you think this is anti-Semitism, happening here?
I think there are a variety of motives, but I think a number of them are realpolitik, vote trading, oil, sovereign wealth funds, fear of terrorism. But yes, Sharri, when I see some European diplomats voting 20 times against the Jewish state, and 0 for most of the rest of the world, some of them seem a little bit content, perhaps guilt over their country's collaboration in the Holocaust, perhaps a certain comfort in, once again, pointing the finger at the Jewish state as being responsible for the world's ills, an idea that has existed for 2,000 years in Western civilization. So I think clearly that kind of obsessive treatment of the Jewish state, the only difference between Israel and other countries that is Jewish, clearly that seems to be one of a multiplicity of factors.
Hillel, thank you so much for your time tonight, and I really appreciate, I'm sure everyone else does as well, the amazing work you do. You are, a genuine human rights activist, international lawyer, fighting dictatorships. Please keep going, and we'll follow all your updates. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sharri.